Okay, good evening and welcome to the latest installment of the Center for Modern Torah Leadership's Summer Speaker Series. You can tell that tonight's speaker is extremely special to me because I'm actually carrying a jacket, and not only that, even a tie. This is much more formal than usual. It is my pleasure and privilege tonight to introduce my friend Rabbi Linzer, the Rosh Yeshiva Shivat Tov Torah. Rabbi Linzer is brilliant, learned, passionate, and thoughtful, and I think we all know that he is one of the voices shaping both the modern Orthodox present and the modern Orthodox future. As I tell my students often, the obligation of congregants to rabbis, constituency to rabbis, students to teachers, is to bring everything they have to listen and to respond. So I'm looking forward to a very lively, thoughtful, passionate, and where possible learned and brilliant discussion between Rabbi Linzer and the audience. I think this is a great opportunity for our community. I'm pleased and honored that so many people from other communities have come tonight as well, and so I shall cease getting in the way of the evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Clapper. It's really wonderful to be here and to be in this community. And Rabbi Clapper decided to take his jacket and to actually have a jacket carried with him. So I decided to take off my jacket. So we sort of met in the middle there. So. But it's really been a wonderful opportunity, first to be giving a shiur to the students of the summer Beit Midrash, and it was Rabbi Clapper at that time also encouraged them to challenge me and to push back, and as a result the shiur went for 2.5 hours. So I want to tell you that was probably the longest shiur I've given in about the last decade, and we're going to keep this to an hour. So I want to encourage the pushback, but also for your sake and for my sake, it's been a long day. We're going to do this. We're going to do this in an hour, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to really discuss very important and relevant issues. As you all know, the theme for the series is the issue of inclusion. And this is particularly within halakha, and I would say not just halakha, but maybe at least as important is in practical ways within the Jewish community. And I speak about this from a very personal perspective because my two boys are both on the autism-Asperger's spectrum, high functioning. In some ways, high functioning can be more of a challenge in terms of the inclusion issue within the community because it becomes something that my wife and I turned in a op-ed that we wrote for the Jewish Week a number of years ago, which I have copies of here if people are interested. It's the issue of invisible disabilities. You know, everybody says, why are your kids acting so weird? Like, you know, why can't they behave? And it is a different type of a challenge sometimes. I'm not saying worse, everyone has its challenges, but sometimes then the physical disabilities or other types of disabilities, there are always unique challenges that present themselves. But this is clearly an issue that is one that I am deeply invested in personally, and one that I know has to be engaged and embraced at the communal level, again, not just in terms of halakha, but also in terms of the community, its sensitivity to this, it's being proactive around these issues, it's being thoughtful around these issues. And as I mentioned to the students earlier, sometimes, you know, it's easy to not be obvious about things that should be right in front of you. Even with a desire, a properly motivated desire for inclusion. Just as an example, when we had in the yeshiva, every 2 years we do a full week of intensive learning, both in terms of halakha, in terms pastorally, engaging people with disabilities. We spend a full week on this issue at Chovei Torah every other year, once on physical disabilities and once on one of the times on emotional, behavioral, and learning disabilities. And when we did this about now 2 years ago, I actually had a very nice write-up in the foreword, again, also if you want to take a look at this. We had Rabbi Michael Levy, who was a blind rabbi, come and speak to the students. And he told us, and this really stayed with me. He said to us, he says, when I go to other shuls, he says, I speak to the rabbi, and I say, Rabbi, do you have Braille Sidurim? And he says, invariably, the rabbi says, no. So then I say to the rabbi, why not? So the rabbi says, well, because no blind people ever come to shul. So he says, then I pause for a minute and I say, do you think there might be a reason why no blind people ever come to shul? And it's so true that we can sometimes not be aware of things that we're not doing, or that we're not aware that we're doing, that are implicitly telling people that they are not welcome, they're not wanted. And it's really an issue that we have to learn how to embrace, and be thoughtful and proactive about it. Again, both at the halachic and at the communal level. And look, I admit my own failings in that regard. I mentioned to students that when we did this whole conference on people with physical disabilities, or a week of training, and we didn't have anybody there doing signing. When we posted it up on the web, we didn't have closed caption available. And it's just, it's important first that we talk a good game, but it's also beyond talking a good game, then you have to really start living up to that, and it's really something that requires constant reaffirming and revisiting. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at this issue from the perspective of the ger, because this, I think, presents an interesting model of thinking about different sensitivities around the issue of inclusion. Now, what I mean by this as a model is, I am not making a halachic argument. I'm not saying, look, there's a mitzvah to love the ger. Part of the whole idea of a ger is somebody that is easily marginalized within the community. Therefore, all of the halachot and all of the mitzvot that apply to a ger apply to anybody who would be in a similarly marginalized position. I just don't think, in a way, I'd like to make that argument, but I just don't think that there's a halachic basis. The one thing that's interesting to note is that the Sefer HaChinuch, when he speaks about the mitzvah to love the ger, does say that that he thinks that the idea of ger does not limit it to only the convert, but includes, he says, anybody that's basically not, in a foreign country and feels not sort of that, that this is not his home country and feels separate from the society and not included in the society, he thinks that this mitzvah applies as well. It's quite interesting because he's really evoking, by talking about the sort of foreigner is included in the concept of ger as convert, he's really evoking what meaning of the word ger. What meaning? Ger rabbinically is understood as the convert. But what's ger in the Torah? The pshat of ger? What? The sojourner, right? The person that ger v'toshav anochi machem ki gerim yitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Right? It doesn't mean you were converts in the land of Egypt. You were foreigners in a foreign land. You were sojourners, resident aliens. That's what a ger is. Ger v'toshav, a resident alien. And the mitzvah, the pshat of the sukkim, is that the mitzvah to love the ger is this is somebody in your land, somebody you have a responsibility towards. They're not a citizen, but you have a responsibility towards them, and that's the mitzvah of ahavas ger. So what he's doing is he is re-invoking and evoking the biblical meaning of the word ger is included in that mitzvah. But at least what he's doing is he's broadening it somewhat and saying that might not just be limited to the idea of the convert. So I would, at one level, it would be nice if we could make a technical halachic argument to abstract that concept. But there is no real basis in any of the sources to interpret that in a more abstract way. Nevertheless, the question still is, what is the Torah sort of the deeper values that the Torah is communicating to us? There are, maybe it seems like a little bit crazy what we what do you mean about obligations of values? We should only be talking about halacha. Any other type of discussion is not relevant. Well, I'll give you an example, about where sometimes we really embrace the idea of values and really feel sort of their sense of a mandate, not just extra credit. I think in general we have to work better at feeling a sense of our obligation towards Torah values and not just Torah halacha. And sometimes it even gets translated in concrete halachic ways. So for example, there's an idea of, many people understand that there's a mitzvah of meiser ksafim, of tithing your income. Now, in the Torah, there's only a mitzvah of giving tithes, giving maaser from your grain, and only grain in Eretz Yisrael. There's only a little bit of a problem, which is that society shifted, and A, Jews stopped living in Israel, and B, they stopped being farmers. So what happens? So all of the idea behind Meiser just goes out the window, because technically there's no more halacha, end of the story. Or do we say that we continue to, embrace the value and find a way that we translate that into a contemporary practice, that really gives full expression of that value. Now, it is true by Meiser, you have precedent to that without it being about grain. Avram gives Meiser, from the booty of Sodom and Amorah. But nevertheless, it's not just limited to a halachic discourse. If we really sort of identify with those values should maybe translate into real sort of a sense of shaping our practice and responsibilities. So that is really what I want to look at, is I want to look at the case of Ger and see what are the mitzvos that apply to Ger and how that can serve to make us think about a broader sense, at least of a moral or values mandate of what our responsibilities are to others who are not technically Ger, but are in a similar situation of being perhaps marginalized within the society. The Ger is likely to be marginalized because he's not native. He came from the outside. People will easily see him as a foreigner. So and clearly people with disabilities are, for very different reasons, marginalized both in practice and in terms of attitudes, and can certainly be seen conceptually to be in a very similar category. So let's now take a look at some of the aspects of our obligation to the Ger and sort of think about how that might translate. So if we take a look at the sources that I've handed out, we're going to first look just briefly at the issue about even attitudes in terms of the process of conversion, but we'll mostly shift to the issues around after somebody has converted. So the first source here from the Gemara in Yevamot, if you have the handout, it talks about what we say to somebody who is coming to convert. Amar Mar, Ger Shabbat Gayer, Omrimo, somebody comes to convert, you say to him, Mari te Shabbat Gayer, what motivated you to come? Modina some mitzvahs kalos, mitzvahs chamuras. This is an edited text. We tell him some of the mitzvos. Now, my time, says the Gemara, what's the reason you sort of tell him the mitzvot and you sort of push back at him? The parish nifrosh, because if he wants to leave, let him leave now. If you're not ready to do it, the Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Koshin Gem Yisrael Kesapachas. Converts are as difficult to Jews, very harsh statement, as like a sword, as a scab. Okay, so that's one statement, and therefore, if you're not going to be serious about it, we don't need you. We sort of like are skeptical about Gerim, and we see that they could be very problematic. Then the Gemara says, Kibel, if he accepts, Malino Somiyah, then you give him a bris milah, and there's a sense like immediate. Right? You're really on top of the process. My taima, why do you do it immediately? Shihui mitzvah lo mashina. Once, this person has passed the test and is somebody we're going to actually go through with the process, we don't want to delay it. It's a mitzvah. So here what I think is interesting about this source is juxtaposed. You have two, they're not necessarily opposing, there's ways to reconcile them, but on the face of it, two opposing attitudes. One is, we want to bring somebody in. It's a mitzvah, we have to do it with as much alacrity as possible. Right? The other is, we're very hesitant. This guy could be a lot of problems. We got to push away. We've got to be very, the Gerim are like difficult for the community. That's another approach. Now, of course, they're not necessarily contradictory, because, if they're sincere, then we want them. If we're not sure whether they're sincere or not, that's when we're pushing them away. But nevertheless, it does sort of, raise the question of sort of how much you start by looking at this with a sort of skeptical, hesitant, protective eye. How much do you look at it as something like that you want to sort of encourage proactively? And the reason I bring this in is, and look, there's a lot to say here about the whole attitude, more in depth if the whole focus was just on Gerim, but about sort of different attitudes in Chazal about Gerim exactly along these lines. Some seeing them as extremely positive, very laudatory about what it means that they were able to actually come from the outside, make this decision. What does it mean that you could have had a whole, open world to you, and you chose to become Jewish, to limit yourself, to abandon your previous family, and everything that you grew up with, and it's extremely awed and embracing. And then there are others that are very hesitant and skeptical and sort of, we're not sure we really, you're really going to be good for the community. And this plays out even in contemporary practice, these sort of competing attitudes. So of course you could say, well, at one level, again, we test, once you reach a certain threshold, then we're going to be more embracing. The reality is that some people tend to always be very skeptical and always not, and some people tend to be maybe always embracing, and there are these competing issues. Why do I bring this up? I'm bringing it up because I think that the same type of thing happens, that we should be aware that there are that this attitude of, we can talk about, and I can talk about, of course, the mandate and the importance of inclusion, but there are going to be people that are going to say, 1 minute, what about all the problems that are going to come up? Like if we have certain people in our show, it's going to be very disruptive. And if we talk about building ramps, that's going to, take a lot of money away from a lot of other things. And there's a lot of issues about, well, what about all the problems that might come up if we sort of are overly pushing, this sort of mandate of inclusion. I just want to at least put on the surface that already, even with all of the mitzvahs of Ahavas Gerim, there was also small voices in the Gemara that were more reluctant. And that's something that has to be addressed, have to recognize that people will have those issues. Some of those concerns might be legitimate and have to be addressed. Some of those might be not legitimate, and some of those have to be trumped by other values. But those voices, will exist within any community. So that's just point number one. Now, if we're going to skip a little bit and take a look here at the third source, because for the sake of time I won't be reading everything inside. We have the following in Masechet Gerim, which is a sort of a collection of Breitot. It's a question of exactly when it was finally edited. But here's exactly what it has. Here's what it has there. After the person has been converted, Tavav Allah, after the person goes to the mikvah, now comes up from converting, Omrim lo, we say to him, Dvarim tovim, Dvarim shonichunim, b'mi nidbakta, we console him, we embrace him, or her, we say, who did you choose, or cleave to? Ashrecha, b'mi shamar v'hayo olam baruch hu, you've chosen now to be, to God, shalom nivra olam b'shvil Yisrael, now it's great to be part of the Jewish people, v'lo nikra banim l'makom al Yisrael, some people might find the highly particularist aspects of this a little troubling, but this is certainly the attitude of the Gemara. How about the fact that we were trying to dissuade you and said, don't think it's so great being Jews, we have a hard time, don't think you're going to get Olam Haba. All that we said to you, only so that to increase your reward if you would be able to go past the test and show the depth of your sort of sincerity and conviction. So, this really, again, sort of points to the idea that the deep sense of what it means to really be embracing, be including, acknowledging that there might be some issues, but I think that this sort of puts those types of concerns, in a bracketed context. They are concerns, they are real, they have to be addressed, but that doesn't mean that they are the dominant sort of view of what is going on here. Now, I do want to just say one comment about this as it deals with Gerim in a very sort of troubling contemporary application, because, this might be said, this sort of frames it as a mitzvah to move the process along, which some have interpreted to mean even a mitzvah to accept Gerim, or certainly accept Gerim who are, who sort of demonstrate their sincerity. So there are some that really sort of see that sort of sense of that proactive responsibility. Not everybody agrees with it, and others say, there's no real mitzvah to accept Gerim, and really the mitzvah is once somebody is a ger, there is a mitzvah of to love the ger, which we will get to in a moment. But this has led to, sadly, some very deeply disturbing issues, particularly in Israel in recent years, where you might be aware, there have been cases where, with Rav Druckman and others, the chief rabbinate decides that wholesale reversal of 1,000 conversions, because this rabbi was doing it, he was using this process which we didn't like, or other cases, there are some very deeply disturbing stories about somebody who goes to get, I know this is practical, it was reported by somebody on the Basin, that a woman came to get a get, 20 years after her marriage. She appears before the Basin, and she's wearing pants. And they look in her teeth, and they see that 20 years ago she had converted. So they decide, well, she's wearing pants, so she's not shomer halacha, so therefore the conversion she did 20 years ago wasn't a serious Kabbalas mitzvos, so therefore she's not really Jewish, so she doesn't need a get. And this really was a psak of a particular Beis Din in Israel. Now the response is like, besides, like we could argue the technical halachas of gerus and Kabbalas mitzvos and, the problems with that, but besides which, the response could be like, can you imagine how completely this destroys this person's entire life? Who knows about her children, her whole identity? Whatever happened to the mitzvah of ahavas ger, right? Loving the ger. So there's an answer to that. What do you think the answer to that is? This isn't a problem of the mitzvah of loving the ger because she's not a ger. It turns out she was never Jewish to begin with. Okay, so that comes from a particularly, I would say, narrow, very, very narrowly defined approach to what the obligations here are. And again, that's all touches on one of the themes that we've already raised, which is the question of the technical halachic obligations, and also some of sort of the deeper sense of responsibility and values that are in play. So those are just like as some slight words of introduction. What I think is more interesting is how it plays out in terms of once somebody has converted and what special mitzvahs the Torah recognizes relating to the ger. And here we can identify, and I'm really trying to be sensitive to the time, so we'll probably be reading a lot less inside, but here we can identify, positive mitzvot and negative prohibitions. Positive mitzvah primarily is v'ahavtem et hager, you should love the ger, which again we said, pshat means the stranger, or more specifically the resident alien, because Geirim Eitim Beretz Mitzrayim, but according to Chazal it means love the convert, love the person who has converted, which becomes then the translation of that idea once you no longer have an identity based on land and country. So somebody from the outside who is among you that you have a responsibility for becomes not the resident alien, but becomes the person who has now converted. Except the difference being that that person is no longer on the outside, but at least they started on the outside. That's the mitzvah of loving the ger. And then there's also a negative prohibition, the ger lo tilchatz v'lo te'onenu, do not oppress the ger, do not afflict the ger, ki gerim eyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. So I want to look at some of the technical aspects of these mitzvot, and they will give us, I think, a greater sense of the sensibilities that are at play here in terms of this. We're going to, again, I'm just look at these sources very selectively. I'm going to start by reading the Rambam here in source number 6, where he deals with some of the negative mitzvot. And here's what he says. Kol ha'ma'aneh, this is on page 2. Kol ha'ma'aneh ger, bein b'mamon, bein b'tvarim. Anybody who afflicts the ger, whether with words or whether with cheats him in terms of monetary issues, over b'shlo shalav, transgresses 3 prohibitions. Shenemar v'ger lo toneh, do not afflict. Zu hanayat dvarim, that's to hurt the person with one's words. V'lo tilchatzenu, do not oppress them. Ze hanayat mamon, that is to mistreat them in monetary matters. Halamadata shekol ha'manet ger over b'shlo shalavim. So there's 3 prohibitions a person transgresses. Mishum lo tonu ishitamito, because he's just a normal fellow Jew that you're not allowed to afflict. Mishum al tonu ishat achiv, again the normal category of a normal fellow Jew. And mishum ger lo tonen, also not afflicting the ger. Now what we see here in the Rambam, and again I'm skipping over some of the Gemaras, but what we see here is a theme that comes up a number of times about the ger, which has to do with the Gemara emphasizing how many extra prohibitions there are. So there's a mitzvah of loving the ger, but there's also a mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew. So it says, loving a ger is so important that it's not just the one mitzvah, but it's 2 mitzvahs. There's a prohibition of afflicting a ger, there's a prohibition of afflicting a fellow Jew. So okay, but a ger is so important, it's not just 1 or 2, it's 3. Okay, if that's all you are left with, then, all right, it's just underscoring how important it is. Don't actually, for 2 reasons. Number 1 is the normal sort of likelihood that you will see this person as not an equal citizen, so you won't even afford this person the normal treatment that you would a Jew. So that's underscoring the need of that. And number 2, maybe because, and this is the point we'll get to, because the person is more vulnerable, you need to actually be more on top of, more sensitive to the way your words and your actions might influence. That's maybe all we would say if we were just sort of counting the numbers. An extra time to underscore that it certainly applies and that may be in greater sensitivity. But when we look more closely, other issues emerge as well. So for example, the issue about lo tonu, the Rambam talks about with words and with money. Now, the commentators on the Rambam point out that if you read the Gemara more closely, you'll see that the Gemara says, like, no, there's some prohibitions about money, and there's some prohibitions about words, and they're distinct. And the Rambam somehow, and when the Rambam deals about way you treat your fellow Jew, the Rambam keeps them distinct. All of a sudden here, when he talks about the ger, he lumps them all together. Says, lo tonu, lo tilchatzenu, you 3 times, whether it's money, whether it's words, and he doesn't make any distinction. What's going on, they ask. And here's an answer that they give. They say, when it comes to the ger, actually, even if all you did was hurt the ger or oppress them with your words, you actually also transgress the prohibition of afflicting them with monetarily. And even if all you've done is afflicted them, cheated them in business monetarily, you also transgress afflicting them with your words. Why? What's the logic there? So let's think about this. This is not my own idea. This is, again, a number of different commentators of Rambam say this in one way or another. Let's start with the issue about money. Let's say you overcharge the ger. Guy walks into your shop, and really this bottle of milk, whatever, goes for $2. You charge him $4. Okay, so now you have cheated him. So that's lo tonu. That would just be applied to your fellow Jew. But now, when it comes to the ger, not only have you cheated him monetarily, you've afflicted him with words. And now you didn't use your words, but it's the effect of the same type of a way that a verbal affliction would be. How could that be? How would this person, when they find out they've been cheated, what are they going to be thinking? Like if you're just a Jew and you've been cheated, it says, that no good so-and-so, he robbed me of $2, he charged me twice the price of that bottle of milk. What do you think if you're a ger and you've been cheated? What do you want to say? Do you want to respond? Did I see you?
I did it because I'm a ger.
Yeah, he thinks he can do this to me because I'm a ger. He would never think about doing this to a fellow Jew. He thinks I'm some second-class citizen. He can do whatever he wants. So it becomes interpreted as something that is about his marginal status and reads it through that lens, whether or not that's what's intended, and that's the impact that has. It's like, I don't know, sometimes in New York you see these little signs in the windows of electronic stores, Hanacha l'dovrei ivrit. You ever see that? so if you can read the sign, you get a discount. So it's basically like, okay, fair treatment to real Jews, not to you, not to the ger. You're the one. Whether or not that's true or not, that's a way to be felt. How about the opposite? Let's say you go ahead and you afflict them with your words, and you basically, in public, you say something to them about, what do you know? You're a convert, or like, something of that nature. Why should we care what you say? You're a convert, or what it was, how, you came from this type of a background. You say these very hurtful, painful types of things. How could that also be a type of afflicting in monetary means? What could be the impact of that? Right? What do you think the impact could be? Is it maybe he's going to have a harder time now getting a job? Maybe it'll lead to other people feeling that they can not see him as one of them and that they can go ahead and also overcharge him, or other types. There's more of a likelihood, certainly more of a perception, but maybe even actually a real fact, because unfortunately people don't always act in the ideal and are shaped by the words of society in terms of how that then will translate in terms of the economic realm as well. And therefore, the Mefarshim say that by the ger, these things actually cannot be really held fully distinct. Now, it could be true in general. Somebody insults you, that might influence how other people think. But by a ger, it's different, because the insulting comes together with a marginalization, and a marginalization that can play out at a societal level. And therefore, it could have, and is much more likely to have, much broader type of an impact. So this is, halachically, one of the things you learn by Honas Ger, and one of the things I would say is important to be thinking about in general in terms of responsibility and mandate to those who might more easily be marginalized. How certain types of treatment and exclusion can be read and felt in a much more personal way, in a much greater way of marginalization, even if that wasn't intended, even if sometimes it just happens because we're not thinking enough about putting in a ramp and having Braille Sidurim. Certainly, even if that wasn't the intention, and number two, how certain types of words, and believe me, with parents with kids with, as I said, invisible disabilities, you get a lot of harsh words about, when they're growing up and when people sort of are not sensitive to what those realities are, and what that leads to people's feeling about whether they belong within the community or don't belong within the community, and how that affects other people's perceptions as well, and sort of the broader implications and not just the immediate sense of hurt. So I think there's a lot of things to be learned from the bringing together, of these two realms, in addition to the basic point that is said more globally, which is that just because of that sense of vulnerability and outsiderness, it's much more easy that somebody is much more sensitive and possibly feels much more likely to feel a sense of slight, even if another person wouldn't. But this, I think, also points to the broader types of ways in which one type of thing translates into another. Yes?
You say that this is for one who has converted, so why are you still using the term ger? Because if he's converted and he's to the mikvah,
Right.
isn't he now one of the children of Israel?
So absolutely, and that's exactly the point of the Torah and of these mitzvot. But the problem is that sadly, as individuals and as society, we often don't operate in terms of those sort of realities. And we will often view people as, as outsiders and be more likely to marginalize them regardless of what their sort of legal status is and regardless of what the Torah is telling us to do. Yes?
At the time of the Rambam, is it clear though that ger does mean someone who's actually already gone through the process of conversion?
Yes.
Or, as opposed to a ger b'toshav, someone who's living in the Jewish.
Correct. I mean, I didn't lay out the sources, but in the Gemara and in the Rambam, it's clear. Now, there are some gers in the Torah that are ger toshav, but these mitzvah of ahavas hager and onas hager are spelled out explicitly to be about ger tzedek, about a full convert. I want to say one other thing about the issue of ona'at dvarim and how that sort of plays out, and this in practical ways about the ger, and then we're going to look at the mitzvah of ahavas hager. And this is, also about it gets to the heart of sensitivity about these issues and putting yourself in somebody else's place, and the way in which well-intentioned people can sometimes do harm, and because they're not really empathizing sufficiently. I have heard from a lot of people who are Yerim that it is so, the ways in which well-intentioned people in passing comments will make them feel marginalized. One example is, and maybe this would never have occurred to you, sitting around a table, and some discussion comes up, and then you turn to your guest and say, well, you're a convert, why don't you tell us about what your experience was? Or, why don't you tell us what it was like about, before you were Jewish? Or, now, you're just trying to involve them, you're touching on something personal, like we sometimes do that in meals, right? We sort of say, well, you come from California, tell us about this experience. But what you've just done is you've basically, all of a sudden this person was an equal member of the discussion and of the, and of the group, and you've singled them out and sort of acknowledged, well, actually, you're a little bit different. You came from the outside. Now, again, maybe people won't look at that in a jaundiced way. People won't think differently of this person. Maybe this person actually doesn't mind that. They're very happy to talk about those experiences. But very often, it can actually basically say, you're other. You're from the outside. You're not fully, one of us. A ger once told me that a woman had converted, 40 years ago. Her husband died. She was sitting Shiva. Somebody said to her in the Shiva, now that your husband has passed away, will you continue to be Jewish? Can you imagine? Can you imagine? So, these types of things, again, a lot of harm is done by people with good intentions. Another person said that, when they tell, and this was a person that was happy to talk. She had recently converted. She was happy, to sort of put that on the surface that she had converted. And somebody would say to her, well, who was your base day? Who was on your base day? Right? Which is basically you have to tell me information so I can decide whether I really trust the fact that you're Jewish or not. So it happens so frequently that we can, by not being aware of what it might mean to be seen of as not equal and not and not sort of a natural part of the group, and the potential of being marginal and being an outsider, about the type of sensitivity that requires. And I would say that is sort of the other sort of thing. One is how these comments can be particularly, the broader impact that they can have, and the broader way that they can be interpreted, and the broader impact on society. And the other is the heightened degree of sensitivity of how things, simple things can basically reinforce a person's outsider status. So that's in terms of the issue of onas hager. And I think that you can probably I hope you can make some obvious translations to that in terms of other people in a similar sense. I want to talk for a little bit about the mitzvah of ahavas hager, loving the giver. Because by there as well, the Gemara says, as I said, 2 times, 3 times, so important, and okay, but again, rather than saying it's really important and we have to be more sensitive, is there something more specifically concrete that it's adding at some qualitative level? And here, let's take a look at sources number sort of 7 and 8 about ahavas hager. So here we have the psukim in Dvarim. Ki Hashem Elokeichem hu Elokei Elokim v'Adonai Adanim ha'el ha'gadol ha'gibor v'ha'nara asher lo yiseh panim v'lo yikach shochat. Oh, look at that. I forgot to put a dash between ha'el. So all these pages are shameless. I try to avoid that, but I forgot it at one point. Anyway, God is the most highly God. Osem mishpat yatom v'almana v'ohev ger latet lo lechem v'simla. No matter, even though God is completely transcendent and mighty, He is one of the ways, and this again is such an important point, that it shows what that power and might is about, is demonstrated through the concern of those that are most vulnerable. He does the mishpat of the yatom v'almana v'ohev ger. God loves the ger to give him bread and raiment. V'ahavtem et hager, you should love the ger. Ki gerim yitem b'eretz Mitzrayim. One of the many places the Torah commands about ahavas hager. Let's look at what the Rambam says. Ahavas hager sheba v'nichnas tachas kanfei hashchina shtei mitzvot aseh. There are 2 positive mitzvot. By the way, this addresses the other question here, spells out. Somebody who came under the divine wings, meaning has converted. Achaz b'nei shu b'chlal re'im. He's included amongst our neighbors. And v'hafta l'reacha kamocha. V'achaz b'nei shu ger. And a special one because he's a ger. V'torah amra v'haftem et hager. You should love the ger. Tzival havat hager, commanded about loving the ger. K'moshe tzival havat atzmo, like God commanded to love God's self. Shenemer v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, love the Lord your God. HaKadosh Baruch Hu atzmo ohev ger, and even God loves the ger. Shenemer v'ohev ger, the verse we quoted earlier. So what's interesting about this Rambam, in addition to saying there's an extra mitzvah, so quantitatively more, is that there's something, there's this idea that we are supposed to love the ger the way we love God. Now, what is the comparison, and where do we see that the mitzvah of loving the ger is treated differently in terms of what it means to love as loving our fellow Jew? What does this mean? We're commanded to love the ger the same way we're commanded to love God. So the answer to this seems to be a point that Ramban al HaTorah makes about the mitzvah of ahavas hager. And the Ramban basically asks us, not ahavas, ahavta l'reacha. Ramban asks a question that we've all asked ourselves, which is, right, we can say, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha zeh klal b'Torah, and put it to a nice Pirkei song, but at some level, we ask ourselves, right, really? Love somebody else as much as I love myself? Is that a reasonable expectation? How am I really supposed to do that? So the Ramban asks this question, and let's see what he answers. This is on page number 3. Here's what the Ramban says. The tam v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Well, maybe it's just an exaggeration. You can't really love somebody like yourself. It's impossible to love somebody else as much as you sort of have concern for yourself and those that are close to you. Halachically, anyway, you have to give precedence to your own concerns. So it's an exaggeration. So really the point is not how we feel emotionally. The point is that in practice, we have to treat our friend, right? Treat your neighbor as yourself. Treat our friend in all matters like we would want for ourselves all good things. And here's the point of grammar that he points out. Since it does not say, you should love your friend like you, le means towards your friend, She'eh perusho hashvot ahavat shnehem b'da'ato, to treat them equal in your mind. Sometimes, okay, I want you to get rich. I don't want you to get smart. I only want some things for you, especially things I have. I don't want you to be better than me in. You should want him to have all good things. So it doesn't mean that it's the same way I feel about myself. So, I'm sorry, I misread that. It says, it says, I'm sorry, what he says is, you want the person to have all good, often you'll be willing to have a person have all good things, but you don't want him to have as much as you have. You want to always be a little bit better. You should not have this sort of this type of disreputable jealousy. You should want it to have as much good and as much success as you want for yourself. Not to give you. Okay, so what he does here is, and maybe it's not so obvious because it gets a little bit lost in the continuing conversation about wanting for your friend. You should want equally for your friend, but it doesn't deeply mean that you really have to feel the same. But in terms of how that translates, in terms of how do you treat them, and what do you wish for them, that's where you have to treat them similarly to yourself. More of an issue of act towards your neighbor like yourself, less than just love your neighbor, feel for your neighbor for yourself. Even if love means the way you feel, it's to want good things for them. It doesn't mean a deep level of how I really feel about them. That is not something that's reasonable to ask. And where does he learn that from? He learns that from the Lamed, Lireacha. It's about how do you feel towards your friend? How do you act towards your friend? It's not et reacha, where he's the object of the verb, but it's lireacha, the way you direct your thoughts and your feelings and your actions towards, but it's not the actual deep love that you have for the friend. That is not something that we can say should be the same for someone else as for you. So that's what the Ramban says is what you learn from the Lid. And now we understand why the Rambam, and also it's based on Gemara, says that loving the ger is treated the same way as loving God. Because what does the Torah tell us about the mitzvah to love God? Yahavta et Hashem Elokecha. Right? It's not what we wish for God. It's not acting towards God the way we act towards ourselves. It is about an emotional connection to God, an actual love for God. What does the Torah say by the ger? So in some places it says li, as the Ramban quoted, but what else does the Torah say by a ger? Ve'ahavtem et hager. Right? Not just li, but et hager. So it doesn't have the li, it has an et instead. But what word is missing from the ve'ahavtem et hager that you have by loving your friend? What word is missing? Kamocha. So if we're going to demand the way you command a way to feel, we have to be realistic. We can't demand kamocha. If we're going to demand a way to act, we can say you should act the same way you would act towards yourself, or you should wish for someone what you would wish for yourself. But if we're talking about how you really feel about the person, it's not realistic to say kamocha. Okay, so we're going to be realistic, but at least by a ger, the Torah is now telling us, and this gives us insight into it's not just two mitzvot as opposed to one. It's telling us about truly feeling for that person. A true demand of empathy, not sympathy, empathy. And that is, again, so critical here because, number one, just in order to have their experience what it really means to be part of the community, right? It's very possible that people can act in certain ways, but still, like this is a person that comes up and has no, roots in the community, comes from outside, is basically completely alone in a deep way that most of us are not. And so a big move forward is that they're treated with total equality. But number one is that real feeling of love and concern and empathy is a critical issue that has to be in place here. And number two, going back to a point that I've made earlier, that it's very easy intellectually to buy into the idea of inclusion, but without the empathy, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes and missing a lot of things. So the issue here about the real sense of the emotional component and the empathy is, I think, something that is critically added here by the ger, not just one more mitzvah. Yes?
The ger is not included in V'ahavta L'reacha Kamocha?
He is. And
Right,
there's
so
another
why are you
mitzvah.
saying we're being realistic? Because it can't be less. Whatever we say about the ger has to be at least equal to this.
Correct.
It already includes Hataleicha Kamocha. So
Absolutely.
So then why don't we have Kamocha? Your explanation for Kamocha
No, we
is
do.
that it's
We have
under-
kamocha in the li. We don't have kamocha in the et. When it's a questions of li, what you wish for them and how you act to them, then it's kamocha. When it's a question of et, how you feel, you love them, your emotional relationship to them, that can't be kamocha. It's unreal. It's impossible to demand, as the Ramban says, haflaga. There's no way you could say the way you feel towards somebody to the same way that you feel towards yourself.
Other psukim with that same form seem to strongly indicate it's the other direction. Like we have Ahavta et Hashem Elokecha.
Right,
It's
it doesn't say-
upward, it's not downward. It's my point. It's not that you can't love them as much as yourselves. You love
doesn't
them,
say kamocha
that
in
you-
those
It's a
psukim.
different type of relationship. It's not
With God,
necessarily
it is a
lower.
different
It's
type
not
of
that you're looking
relationship.
down on them. It's that, unless you're looking down on God, which I
No, I don't understand. I don't understand your point. With the God, there's no kamocha in God. There's no kamocha with the et by the ger. Anyway, we can discuss it more afterwards. But I don't understand the point you're making. Yes.
The fact that this is the half-time at the ger versus the Hashem L'Kefra.
Yes.
Is it possible that there's also much more of a communal, is the half-time, has a...
The plural language,
Plural.
as opposed to the v'ahavta in the singular. That's an interesting point, although I should say, and that gets to some of the point we're making here about the communal aspect, although I should say that the classic way of interpreting it, and this will sound ironic, is to read it the opposite, to read that the singular language refers to the community and the plural to the individual. I'll give you one simple example, coming up to Shemitah. So by Sfiras HaOmer, there's a mitzvah for every individual to count. By counting the 7 sevens for Yovel, the mitzvah is only at the communal level for the Beis Din. The Midrash Halacha notices the difference based on the grammar. By Sfiras HaOmer it says V'safarta Lecha. I'm sorry, by Sfiras HaOmer it says V'sfartem Lachem. By Yovel it says V'safarta Lecha. So you would have thought, like you said, Lachem is everybody, it's a communal. But the assumption is no. When it uses the plural, it means all of you individuals, as individuals. Whereas when it uses the singular, it means you as a corporate community, as a single entity. So I like the point, I have to think about that, but normally the midrash, sort of the halachic interpretation tends to go the opposite way. Yes?
Just a brief sort of question. I know that in college biblical Hebrew, they would always tell us that we're stuck with romantic notions of ahava because we live in the year, whatever
Yes.
year it was when I was in college.
Yes.
But really, at least my grad from Mark Robbins would say ahava meant something more like loyalty or something like that, more than what we have as a notion of
As an emotion, right. I think that's a very good point, and I've heard the point made before, that certainly in Semitic cultures, I mean, you're sort of making it from a language point of view, but I think it's all connected. In Semitic cultures, a lot of these things which we sort of frame as interior emotions are really questions about how one acts. So, so the ahava means exactly what the Ramban says is ahavta lireacha, is about how the way you act towards somebody, not just the sort of emotions that are going on inside of you. I think that that's a legitimate point. Again, I don't know if necessarily that proves that Chazal, they might have, in terms of, thought otherwise about it, and there is some meaning about comparing Avos Hager to Avos HaMakom, but it is a legitimate point. I do wonder, having said that, some psukim Yaakov sees Rachel and says, "Vayov Yaakov es Rachel." So does that mean loyalty? Does that mean? I mean, clearly that seems to be about his emotional feelings for her. So I think it might, to say it in such categorical terms, I'm not, but I think it is definitely a good point. Yes.
Is there the risk that by making the distinction of the specific mitzvot for ger that we perpetuate their differentness?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if the Torah said, like the Constitution, a ger, you treat him like a Jew, period.
Excellent.
And then why do we have to keep just making it clear? It's almost like we're doing special affirmative action.
Excellent. You have provided me with the perfect segue at the perfect time, because all of this is wonderful, but all of this is special treatment. So, if you take a look, all of the Moni HaMitzvahs and all of the Gemaras talk about X number of mitzvahs of Ahava and so many lavim of Ono and Lotuchatzenu, and they count them in the Minyan HaMitzvahs in all these ways. Then you turn to this work called Sefer HaMitzvahs of Rav Saadia Gaon. So, Gonim, one of the later Gonim, but one of the Gonim, and he wrote a little list of the mitzvot, It's actually a tiny little poem that could probably fit on 2 sides of 1 page. And like every mitzvah is, it rhymes. And every mitzvah, basically, he covers 1 mitzvah like for every 1 word. Sometimes he has 2 words for a mitzvah. So it's a very terse little poem that sort of covers the mitzvot. And it's hard to know by the way he's doing it, like to what degree is he making the halachic statement about those things. But certainly, like somebody has taken that little poem and turned it into a huge 3-volume work as a way of exploring conceptually how these mitzvahs are understood. But if you look at how he describes the mitzvah by the ger, here's what he says. Source number 10, which is the perfect segue. Here's all he says about a ger. Gerei hatzedek ke'ezrach. He doesn't say there's a love the ger. He doesn't say don't oppress the ger. He says, right? He says like the Torah says, Mishpat echad yelachem lager u'lezrach haaretz. You know what the mitzvah is? Treat them just like everybody else. That's the mitzvah. And that really raises the exact question, right? Are we affirmative action, or do we believe that affirmative action constantly sort of reinforces the difference and the outsider status? So let's say, for example, there was a decision that Gerim do not have to serve in the army, because we have a mitzvah of loving the ger, and therefore we want to protect them, or you don't have to serve in the army. So I think that probably, the Gerim might feel very much that that's reinforcing their outsider status. Let's say you had not a overcharge for Gerim, you had a big sign up in your store that said discount for Gerim, right? Does that make it better? So this I think is exactly this question. And on the other hand, like people will say about affirmative action, it's like claims like, oh, there's no longer any racism. It's very nice to say that that's where we want to get, is to not have to deal with that difference. But if the reality is that people are constantly falling short of that ideal, we might have to underscore, right, that sense of higher sensitivity, higher awareness, higher obligation, because if you just sort of say no difference, the reality is that they'll be treated different and worse. So I don't think that there's a black and white answer to this. I think that there's actually, these two live in a type of a tension with one another. And I will certainly say that this also plays out in terms of the areas of like inclusion, right? That to what degree, do we sort of, some even sort of take offense at the whole language of inclusion, because the whole language of inclusion says you're other and we're going to include you. Of course, how do you get to treating everybody the same without using that language of inclusion and with sort of, without identifying, you shouldn't say people with disabilities, it labels them, and that's a whole other issue about language, right? Disabled people, people with disabilities, but all of that labels them. We shouldn't be labeling, and there's a whole issue within the community about, about giving like diagnoses and labels and all of those issues. But the problem is you can't get the services without the labels, and you can't get the recognition without the labels. So how do both of these, I don't think that there's an easy answer, but I think it's really interesting that he completely ignores Rav Sagigom, the specific mitzvot, and just says treat them equal. At least that should be seen as the ultimate goal. I'll take the question in a second, one more story about this. When my kids were very small, we had a babysitter from South Africa, and she was, I can't say African American, she wasn't African American. She was black, very dark skinned. My kids had never been introduced to the idea that you could categorize people based on the color of skin, right? Like, we don't think about categorizing people based on their eye color, So if you ask, like, how is, her name, believe it or not, was Cleopatra. How is Cleopatra, do you see any differences between Cleopatra and us? They say, she has slightly darker skin than we do, or something like that. But certainly it never would have occurred to say, she's black, right? Then they went to school and they learned about the history of, the civil rights movement. So all of a sudden, she became black. She became seen as, this different type of a person in a different category than white. Now, the positive thing is they learned about the history of, of oppression and of mistreatment and about the importance of civil rights and about Martin Luther King and about all the sort of fight that has happened that needs to continue. But in order to learn all of that, they also had to learn about how, people have been, how these different labels and people have been categorized differently. So I don't think that there is an answer to this. But I think that it's really important to be holding both of these, at the same time. There was a question, yes?
I don't know why you think the goal is integration. From everything we've seen so far, it seems like the ger is better and has more commandments towards them. And it doesn't seem like the goal is to make them the same.
Well, I think that that's exactly the question, you know. Again, it would be hard for me to understand what you're saying, which is that the reason that it says ahavas hager and onas hager, etc., is because the end result that the Torah is looking for is preferential treatment.
But
You
that's
could
what
say
all-
that.
but that's what all of the
Okay,
versions say.
I understand. You could say that. That's not the way I understand it. I understand the Gemara says in multiple places it's because since they're it's so easy for them to be offended, the Torah we had to reinforce all of these mitzvot and all of these prohibitions, which does not mean that the goal is preferential treatment. The goal is to reinforce the responsibilities so they're not treated worse. But you can say what you say. I just don't think that that's the goal. I think the goal is equal treatment. But how do you get equal treatment if the only way there is through preferential treatment? I think that that's sort of the question at play. Yes.
It's interesting that Chazal chose the word here.
Well, they were working with the biblical verse.
No, but they took the concept of Yer Toshav
Yes.
and in some sense said what we now call a convert
Yes.
is a Ger Toshav. It's already saying something about how they see how problematic status
Mm-hmm.
of the Ger is, because they could have used another term.
You mean they could have just said that this person is a Yisrael?
Or some term.
Right. I mean, I.
But anyway, I think it's suggesting somehow that we recognize that just as problematic as in biblical times a Ger Toshav had,
Yes.
our Ger, if we've gone through the whole thing, we
Right.
know in reality.
Right.
The person's still not going to be fully accepted. I don't know if that's
Right.
in their
So you're
mind,
saying in
but
a way it heightens the likelihood of them being marginalized, but maybe the other
No, I
side.
think they're doing it because they know full well.
Right.
Maybe they know full well that this person is in danger of not being accepted.
Is a.
In danger of not being accepted.
Right. So they have to therefore
Torah had to warn people.
have to warn them about that. But the flip side of that is, and that gets back to the whole point I was making about labeling people as white or black, the flip side of that is that then Ger is always a distinct category from Yisrael. And I have to tell you, sometimes the hardest Gemaras for me to read is when the Gemara says, when it sort of talks about who are the people that a certain mitzvah